Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bill MacDonald, CEO of ScotCHEM. Welcome to this Edinburgh International Science Festival event, Catalysing Creativity. Chemistry is fundamentally important to our everyday lives, from clean drinking water and energy to plastic and life-saving drugs. Most of our everyday needs have been influenced or even created by it, and chemistry in Scotland really punches above its weight. There are 240 Scottish companies based in the chemical sciences. They directly employ more than 11,000 people, with a further 70,000 jobs indirectly dependent on the industry. Last year, 4.4 billion of Scotland's exports were directly related to chemistry, and chemistry accounts for 1.3 billion of gross value add to our economy. And Scotland's chemistry research at universities is ranked third in the world for R&D. ScotCHEM is a Scottish research pool for chemistry, which means we represent chemistry research across all our universities. We showcase our chemistry research internationally, we facilitate industry academic collaborations, and we provide and coordinate training and knowledge transfer for the chemical science sectors. And very importantly, we undertake public and community engagement to showcase chemistry and how it contributes to society. But it's important that we don't just preach to the converted, that is, people who are already involved in or interested in science. Chemistry impacts all of us and has a major role to play in helping us meet some of society's grand challenges, everything from COVID response to net zero emissions by 2045. But how do we reach new audiences? When I worked in the chemical industry, one of the things we debated lots were, where does innovation come from? Where is our next big game-changing market opportunity going to come from? And we tried many different models, but one of the things we did try was to engage with the art community. The hope was always that something unusual that we hadn't thought of would come up. I like the Donald Rumsfeld notion, and I'm paraphrasing here. There are things we know, there are things we know that we do not know, but there are also the unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know. And to find the unknown unknowns, we often need to step out of our comfort zone, take a different perspective, and even collaborate with others completely outside our normal cohorts. And we thought that by engaging with the art community, that together we could come up with some new ideas that we hadn't even considered. It stimulated us to think in different ways, and it was also lots of fun. So when I came into the ScotCHEM role, we were planning a conference for recent appointees in our chemistry departments, primarily focused on where they could get research funding. But we thought we'd take them into the V&A in Dundee, a completely different environment. I like the idea of bringing in groups of creative young designers to work with creative young chemists and just kick ideas around and see what might come out of it. We were very fortunate to work with Miriam Walsh at ASCUS, Art and Science, and Miriam was incredibly helpful in bringing the arts community to the party. And indeed, we came up with some very stimulating ideas, and ideas that from the science side, we wouldn't necessarily have thought of. And that's how Catalysing Creativity came into being. The idea that some of our chemistry researchers would work in collaboration with artists to inspire new works of art based on chemistry that could be exhibited in our universities and public exhibitions. Of course, COVID hit right in the middle of the project, so we've had to be a bit more innovative about how we share the outcomes of the project. The artworks and the collaborations are showcased in an online exhibition hosted on the ASCUS website, ascus.org.uk. So please do drop into the exhibition. And of course, there's this event where we're keen to explore the broader concept of art-science collaboration. And we are delighted that our panel is able to join us today. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Miriam Walsh at ASCUS Art and Science, all our chemists and artists who embraced the project, our panel, and our MC, Dr. Jane Haley, MBE, who is the Edinburgh Neuroscience Coordinator based at the University of Edinburgh. And of course, thank you for taking the time to join us today. Jane will introduce our esteemed panel shortly, but before she does that, we would like to share a short video showcasing the project and the artworks themselves.
We were interested in looking at how we could bring art and science, particularly chemistry, together to maybe shed insight into what actually contemporary chemistry research involves, but also to bring artists and scientists together in a way that through working with artists, chemists could maybe gain a new perspective on their own research, and through artists working with chemists, that they would be able to access what's going on in terms of the innovation within this sector, and to be able to allow that to filter into their own creative practice, and then to share that with public audiences.
Part of the role of ScotCHEM is the public engagement. The public have a suspicion about science and chemistry in particular. They see chemistry as, they see the negative side of chemistry and don't see the positive side of chemistry. So I think by engaging with the public in this way, in an unexpected way, it gets people to realise that chemistry is creative and is positive.
You have scientists that really like to stick within the rules and explore what those rules can do. But you also have a lot of researchers that are all about trying to break those rules, but trying to go beyond what we understand are the rules that govern our natural world. And in doing that, there is an artistic process where it is the own interpretation of the scientist which comes to play. And in that way, I see science and artistry as being very, very, very similar indeed.
I like the idea of trying to bring in a group of creative young designers to work with creative young chemists and just kick ideas around and see what might come out of it. When they came in, you could see the chemists looking at the art and design folk, and they were equally suspicious of the chemistry folk. This is why we're working with them. But once they started kicking ideas around, people got into huddles, and it was just amazing, the creativity and the ideas that came out.
There's definitely things I would never have thought of, looked into, or come up with in this context that Honza did. And that brought a very different dimension, and maybe even begins to pose different questions on how one could interact with different audiences going forward.
So my project was following actually my artistic practice, which is divided between ceramics and photography. So I have created a series of cyanotype prints which were printed on handmade Indian paper, and then I have created a statue which is meant to be used for engaging with the public. So it's not something which should just stand somewhere. So while the statue is there to interact with people, the photographs tells the story of the statue, how it became actually alive, how it happened. There are hidden layers in this project which actually refer back to the original inspiration, which is a catalyzing some reactions. If you think about it in basic terms, there is a reaction and there is a catalyst. In Amanda's actually project, you take some molecule and you insert it inside of the protein. And this idea of something with holes and something else which fills the holes and changes it forever has been replicated in the statue. And there are the messages which can be inserted into these holes. And it doesn't make any difference for the statue, but it will make difference for those people.
The idea is to use us something that the scientists have noticed and draw parallel with our life, and also create a 3D object using that same principle.
That piece of art just makes me think of my own work, because it is such a good representation of what I am trying to delve into as a scientist.
It was all about disorganized molecules in crystals. And it was all about the fact that when you have an imperfection in a system, it looks first as an imperfection, but it makes the system more resilient, and it allows the system more flexibility. But I made the immediate parallel with our society, because society needs a set of people. Some will play the imperfection, or they appear imperfect, but their imperfection makes the whole system better.
So I would never have come up with explaining disorder in crystal structures having parallels with those in society, but Romain saw them, and I see that that is completely true actually. We're explaining these tiny differences on a molecular level, but actually that can apply to society as a whole as well. You take a person out of society, what does it do to society as a whole if that person is missing? I mean, I was so dismissive of the whole thing to start with. I freely admit that. I was really very dismissive, and I used the word pretentious nonsense several times before I actually started the project. But my mind has been changed, and I really think it's been an important learning experience for me. I hope that Romain has got as much out of the experience as I have.
What I hope for and what happened is that once they started working, it would click. Because scientists are also creative, and people forget that. There's a creativity involved in science. And so getting the two sides to work together was just fun. It's stimulating, and interesting ideas come out of it.
Welcome to Catalysing Creativity, our discussion event this afternoon. My name's Dr. Jane Haley. I'm the Scientific Coordinator for Edinburgh Neuroscience and a founder of Fusion and Art Neuroscience organisation in Edinburgh. So I have the great pleasure this afternoon of chairing this session, and before we start our discussion, I'm going to introduce each of our panellists in turn. So if the panellists could each give a little wave when I read their names out, that would be great. So we'll start with Dr. Amanda Jarvis. Amanda is a molecular designer working towards sustainable chemical production at the University of Edinburgh, and she partnered with Honza Tarnowski on their project exploring chemistry through art. Dr. Melanie JIMENEZ is a biomedical engineer who uses art to shape the research she does and the way that she communicates about it. Dr. Martin BRAUND works to widen the horizons of science and science education through arts collaboration and arts-based pedagogy. Oh, I always get that one muddled on my tongue. Dr. Alan Wiles is the Director of Operations at ScotCHEM. He uses his past experience as a researcher in organic chemistry to help deliver the goals of ScotCHEM, which include networking and collaborations, research, innovation and translation, public engagement and knowledge exchange. And our final panelist today is Romain VIGUIER. So he is a sculptor interested in sculptures, systems and sequences. His work is constructed and results from the application of elaborate design rationales. He is interested in using principles that have universal value and could help us make sense of the events we witness and the events that we are also part of. Romain partnered with Dr. Mari Haddo on their work exploring crystal structures through art. Now, Mari and Honza are not able to join us today, but we are absolutely delighted to have Amanda and Romain with us. So I just want to say to the audience that we are going to take questions. We can answer questions as we go through. We ask that you please put your questions in the chat function on your YouTube live stream, and they will then be relayed to the panel and we'll be able to address them as we go through. Okay, so I have to say that was an absolutely wonderful short film to introduce the project and the pieces that arose from them, and I'd really encourage everybody to go and look at the exhibition online. It is a shame it can't be in person, but I think it'd be marvellous if you could all go and have a look. So I'd like to actually start by, before we go into a broader discussion about science and art and the intersection between those two things and how they may catalyse creativity, I just want to start by asking our science and artist partners what they actually how they engaged with the project. So I want to start with Amanda. So could you just talk briefly about how you got involved with this project and what you felt that you got out of it and how it worked working with your art buddy?
Certainly. So I got involved with the project quite a while ago. So I was looking when I came back to Scotland for a postdoc to get more involved with the art side, as I'd had a long interest in that from school. And I found out about ASCUS. And then over time, kind of did a little bit of going to a couple of events. And then finally, they had this art on a postcard event, which is where I first met Honza. And there we were just trying to talk quite informally between a scientist and an artist about our work. And I suppose that kind of set the scene for what later became our collaboration as part of the ScotCHEM commission. And one of the things that I really took away from that first meeting and subsequent meetings was how much the bigger picture resonated with Honza. So I started off trying to kind of explain the kind of fundamentals of the chemistry I was doing, which didn't work too well. My ability to put that into layman's terms wasn't great. But when I started mentioning how we were looking at really helping sustainability and we wanted to make sure that the work chemists did was green and wouldn't kind of harm the environment, that immediately resonated with Honza about what he did. And then, yeah, kind of through playing with clay, we kind of explored further the catalysts that I use and how I make them. And that in turn led to this idea of the story of Gollum and the idea of activating an inanimate object, which I felt had some real resonances with what the work I do, which is trying to bring life to proteins that have no function and turn them into something that can make chemicals. And that's where we kind of started. And that idea of storytelling is something that I've taken away, that can be quite a powerful way to engage the public.
That's great, Amanda. It's really interesting to hear the perspective of the scientist. So now we're going to turn to Romain and ask him, as the artist in obviously the second partnership pairing, to also talk about how you got involved, why you got involved, and how you resonated and worked with your science buddy, and what you feel you got out of that.
Yeah, so how it started, I think it was during this event organized at the V&A in Dundee. I was listening to Mary's talk, so Mary's Haddo's talk about it was disorganized molecules or disorganized structure, and that's a topic I've been interested for some time before. I'm making a lot of regular series as a sculpture or as objects, and I tend to be attracted by the regularity, the uniformity, and have been playing with that for some time. And I've been wanting to go away from that, to break that like seriality and look at some random things. But and for some time I was looking for an opportunity to start looking at this. So when I saw her talk focusing on these particular things in crystals, I thought that's it. She's the perfect collaborator for me, or to look at what's happening really at the crystal level and develop the visual aspect I was kind of stuck in. Okay, so it started as a kind of an aesthetic approach, and then also the second objective for me. I'm quite interested in how society change, especially especially because climate change. So climate change has to make us as a society change, and I was wondering how do society change and adapt to new challenges and new environment. What happened and how is the process going? And so these two questioning, in fact, led me to develop the idea of the project and the parallel between how molecules organize themselves with how individuals organize themselves into a society. So it came as two objectives then. One was a visual objective, breaking with regularity, and the second one was a social kind of understanding objective. And the two, for me, the two go together. Okay, I don't make art that has no implication in your society. So I make art thinking about the fact that it is a way to think about society. Okay, it's not an illustration of society, but it helps make sense of how we are organized, in fact. So when you see structure welded together, that means we as a society are also linked together. So these are the two main objectives for me, and so that's how I met Mary. It was a coffee break at the V&A, so I went straight into her. Hello. And she acknowledged that she absolutely knew nothing about art, and she didn't tell me that she was really dismissive. I thought she had this discussion with someone else at the time, but I think a few days later I've sent her a draft of the proposal that I wanted to submit, and then it started like this.
That's great, and I really enjoyed her comment in the video as well. So that's funny that caught you out. So I wanted to kind of broaden over the discussion out to include all our panel members now. And I thought one good starting point might be to ask the question, how can art inspire science, and can it lead to innovation? So I think this is one of the things that's perhaps in the core of the thinking behind the projects here. So I was going to actually move across and start with Melanie. Melanie, if you're all right to kick off with that.
Yes, of course, happy to. So I think there's so many ways art can inspire science, much more than what we could possibly cover during this panel discussion. But what we've seen already is that by having different perceptions put together, what you create is an increased likelihood to basically have a disruption in your thoughts, in your beliefs, in your judgment. And who knows where that, disruption is going to lead you. I don't see why it could not lead to innovation in some cases. But from a personal point of view, another point that I could highlight maybe is that in my case, having had the opportunity to do art from quite a young age and keep doing it on a regular basis, I feel this has nurtured you know, an open mind and a flexibility when it comes to rethink, which is shaping the way that I do my research. So it's very much still inspiring my work as a researcher on a daily basis.
That's great. So I know when we talked about this in some of our pre-discussions, quite a few other people wanted to talk. Alan, would you like to add to what Melanie has said?
Yeah, I think it's always been something that's niggled me. So I used to be a researcher myself before I took on the role at ScotCHEM in organic synthesis. And it's really strange. I never really made a divide between what I considered as my hobbies in drawings and art and things like that, and what I did in the lab. I actually very much viewed the way in which I designed the molecules for what they needed to be. It was a process of design, and for me, design and art it can be very very linked together. And I think that there's a process of design within science, which is often dismissed as non-artistic. Whereas if you speak to an architect and they tell you that they are designing something, everybody would think that they are being artistic as to what they do. So they're using that term of design and taking it away from the artistic process. So yeah, I never really made the distinction between the two, and very much that openness to look at what I was doing and that critical, you know, you have that critical scientific method, but then you have to have that process of thinking outside the box as well, which needs to be artistic in a manner, because it can be, although it is within the rules of what you understand, it still is thinking outside of the box.
Amanda, I think you've probably got something you want to say about that.
Yeah, just as Alan was talking there, it made me kind of remember that I often think of a lot of what I do is designing molecules. So that language around design and creativity for me has always been part of the science I do. And that's kind of why I chose molecular designer as kind of the two words to describe myself. So I just kind of wanted to reiterate that maybe and highlight that.
I think that brings us quite nicely into something else that I was thinking that, you know, Romain, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. We had this, I'm sure we discussed that with Alan before. And there is obviously a distinction between art and also, I mean, there are many arts also as you know, but between art let's say the art as I conceive it, okay, and perhaps it's just a French way of conceiving art, but let's say it's contemporary art versus, I think it's creativity you are describing, Alan, and scientists need to be creative. They don't need to be an artist, but they need to be creative. And by being creative, that means they have to get loose sometime. They have to get away from their method, like the predictable things that will happen. They need to get away from that to face unknown, and that's how they discover new things. That's how they become creative. But they always apply their scientific method to their whereabout. Okay, when in art, first the objective is different. You are not planning to make anything of use, of physical use. You are just generating new ideas by making things. You know, that's how I conceive it. But let's close it for now.
I think that actually leads us into this question about the process, the creative process in art, and whether or not the process of doing science, you know, what are the overlaps and the similarities, and what are the differences between approaches. So Romain, I think that's obviously something that, you know, you have been thinking about throughout this project.
Yeah. I mean, if you look in the past, I mean, it's possible that before the Renaissance time, you could merge art and science. Great artists like you know, some really famous one, also great scientist, great engineer, great creative mind at the time. And but since I think in science we've developed the methodology. I mean, the methodology was developed in science, and then art also used to be quite academic, quite close to a scientific subject in a way. It had its own renaissance in a way in modern time that detached itself from the academic, becoming more of a conceptual subject, so being closer to philosophy than it was to craft in a way. So originally there were a lot of link between the two, and now it's a bit, I would say more separated, but because of the method, because I believe the scientists, even if they do need to be creative, they also need to follow the scientific method, otherwise they don't do science. When in art you don't need to follow any method, you just follow an instinct or your own way of doing, which will be your practice, which leaves your mark into what you do. So it's something quite personal. In science, I don't think it has to be personal. You have to do things that should be reproducible by others. Therefore, you have to use a method. So that's the difference I make. But I'm sure many people will have some ideas about this.
Well, I know that Martin wants to come in and say something, so.
Yeah, I was quite interested to hear Romain talk about the art produces an object, something, in other words, it's perceived as being useful. And I think sometimes really we think of art having an emotional contact with people. And his artwork is very much about linking to society as well, and this whole disorder within society, which I really, really like. And I think on the problems, I'm an educationalist, and I've worked in schools for so long where the pupils that people teach often see science as this dissociated, unemotional, rather cold enterprise, which is carried out by the scientific method. And I think to break that down using the arts helps make an emotional contact between the learners and the science that they're trying to learn. And that's really the power of arts being used to teach in schools. And we've got generations of school children who see science as being very useful, but they don't really see themselves being involved with it. And they start to turn off science. And we've been promoting through STEM, trying to increase that recruitment, but also end up with a scientifically literate populace. So I think having this emotional contact through using the arts to learn science is a really important aspect. And that's where the two can come together.
Melanie.
Yeah, so maybe just to point around, you know, again, like maybe the scientists being very methodological and how that could reflect on how we perceive science. One point that I can say from just a small subset, I guess, of research community, of scientist community that I work with on a daily basis is that if you look very closely, the process of being creative in science has many shapes and forms as you have people around you. So there is a methodology, it is, you know, a way to reproducibility and things like that. I do agree, but if you really look at the process, I feel that variation is the norm, and I'm assuming that there is something very similar also when it comes to art. So there is a question as to whether we want to see patterns between those two and that we want to compare them. Is that really the full picture or not? That's an open question. I do not have the answer to that.
Yeah, I share. Oh, sorry, I jumped.
No, it's fine. Go ahead, Romain. You're fine.
Yeah, I really share this view. Is that the creativity aspect is about freedom, which means it's up to the individual to kind of make their own way and found their own creative way. And it should not come from anything else, in fact, than from their own interest. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of colleagues, some are really successful. You will have some professor with a lot of publication and a lot of ideas, and often if you talk with them, you will find them, they are interested in everything. So their way of being creative is to be really open. And but everybody is should use their own kind of interest and develop their interest, and or be attentive to their dream. So I'm sure I'm not going to teach you the story of Kekulé and how he managed to figure out the structure of benzene, but the dream was a really important part of that discovery. So you have to listen to your kind of intuition, and it's really an individual path, the creative one. Yeah. So yeah, I agree with you.
So we've already alluded to this apparent separation between science and art, which, you know, we feel in many ways is a little artificial. But what I wanted you to think about is, well, where did the current separation between art and science come from? You know, Romain's already pointed out that historically, you know, people were polymaths. They were very interested in all sorts of things. Martin, you've already briefly touched on this. Would you like to pick this up and talk about it a little more?
Yes, thanks very much. I think this idea of the silos is a metaphor really for this separation of knowledge into, you know, silos are those agricultural things that we see in fields where grain is separated from other grains, so there's no contamination between one and another. So the metaphor is that one set of knowledge contaminates another. I think that's very interesting because education really didn't actually start out like that. If you go back to Greek philosophy and you look at the muses, which were arts, and astronomy was the scientific one in those days, they were regarded as the complete education of the individual. It was emancipation. It's basically individuals should be rounded in all forms of knowledge. And I don't think, and this was also continuated in medieval times and through the early 18th century pedagogues like Comenius and Rousseau's another one in this area. But I think as we became more technologically advanced and through the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment, when science and technology began to grow very quickly, and through particularly the 19th century, there's this continuous separation of the subject disciplines. And I think that's partly because exacerbated by control. And in the 19th century, we had the institutes, the great institutes and the societies, and they began to exercise their power, and they were invested in protecting their own subject areas. So I think there's a lot of protectionism in that, and I think education as a result has sort of has suffered from that separation. And I think you know, that's beginning to break down now. So if you want me to go on to talk about how we might change that.
Well, we could. One thing I just wanted to kind of actually ask, I know this isn't, I know you're based down in England, but up here in Scotland, we have had this curriculum for excellence introduced a few years ago. And the driving force behind that appears to be a sort of crossing disciplines and teaching principles by driving through the different teaching areas rather than confining the subject matter to siloed areas. Do you feel that this is one way forward to try and dissipate these separations?
Well, of course, the Scots have always been a much more enlightened nation than the English. We like to sort of have our protectionism, and maybe that sort of goes through to subjects as well. And there are signs that, I mean, things are beginning to break down. There's always been collaboration between subjects, but it's always been regarded in England anyway, with suspicion. I mean, when I started teaching here in York, I actually taught something called integrated studies. But the parents hated it because they said, well, you know, it's just diluting everything. And we weren't taught that way, and we weren't successful in our education by doing all this art stuff, you know. And I mean, people dressing up as molecules and people dressing up as animals on the seashore and doing all this drama and stuff. It's not really right, is it? So it had a sort of bad press, really. But it's beginning to come back a bit now. There's something called STEAM, which is science, technology, engineering, arts and mathematics, which is beginning to sort of look at subject integration as well. So perhaps we're beginning to catch up with you Scots.
That sounds great. I love the fact that we're still leading lights. So Amanda.
Yeah, I guess I just, following on from that, had a question for Martin about whether he felt that how we examine the subjects, and I guess particularly in England, whether that plays quite a big role in keeping things separate, because that's another difference, I guess, between Scotland England in terms of the number of subjects you do?
I think the problem with assessment is that, I mean, originally assessment, of course, was derived and controlled by those societies and institutes that I talked about. So they maintained that power base there. And that's been one of the problems, is that each of the kind of subject associations tends to control the assessment, and the assessment then tends to control the curriculum. So it's very difficult to break out of this kind of assessment accountability culture, and certainly in England, and to a lesser extent in Wales, I think as well, which shares various similarities in Northern Ireland, but that culture of assessment accountability has sort of made STEAM efforts and integration and multidisciplinary learning more difficult.
Sorry, I did the old I haven't unmuted thing. Alan, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think this whole question of where do the silos start is really interesting to me. I mean, I may not sound like it, but I'm French. I was educated in France. I lived in France until I was the grand old age of 19 before I came to the UK. And the way education is done in France is very different to that which it is done in the UK. I was particularly startled when I heard that my 12-year-old niece had to narrow down her field of subject at the age of 12 to start choosing her GCSEs, and myself and her mom and all our family just being like, how can a 12-year-old all of a sudden start to narrow down their horizons? And this is something that comes very, very strong from a French perspective, because I mean, I even had to pass an exam of philosophy for my final baccalaureate. So that's the level of an A-level qualification. And we had to study philosophy. But we kept all of our subject all the way up until the end, although we do major in specific topics. So some topics we dedicate more time, but we keep that breadth. And it was interesting when I think it was Martin or Romain was talking about, you know, in the olden times, the scientists and the artists it was the full package. You know, they weren't just good scientists, they were great thinkers, they were great philosophers. And that, I think some of that has been retained in France, and trying to engineer that into the population to try and keep a level of that. Obviously, as a school child, you always resent having to do so many exams and so many classes and to so much thing. But in retrospect, I'm extremely thankful to my education and to the breadth of what it has given me, an understanding of geography, of political geography as well, which enables me to look critically at the political world that I'm surrounded by. And some of the things I see are very much missing. I mean, I did a lot of tutoring, of workshop manning for when I was working at the University of Glasgow. And there are certain aspects of what I would consider common knowledge missing from education there. And I think those are just the start of how we silo certain disciplines, but not just disciplines, how we silo certain sectors of life. You know, how we silo what a person working in a refinery should be about, what their social kind of construct should be like, what kind of knowledge should they have. And I do think that is interlaid into loads of levels of society in the UK.
So yeah, so obviously I get a distinct impression that you feel that the type of education that you had, you know, when you were younger, perhaps fostered a greater sense of creativity, that, you know, and the implication from this conversation is that maybe we are unwittingly suppressing that a little bit in our young people. And so I kind of feel that maybe we should actually think a little bit about, well, what actually is creativity? What is that? And so Romain, as our artist today, I'd like you to start us thinking about what creativity is.
I think creativity is about freedom. It's about freedom. It's when you get away from what's expected, when you get away from the normality of your activities, and you let yourself go in a way. So I imagine as a chemist is when you do something that has nothing to do with chemistry, and you still operate because I mean, as a chemist, you probably get trained. Your brain is such a way that You will analyze everything you do under your prism. And so the idea is to expose your brain to something else, to different aspects. And give yourself the freedom. So I think that's it. That's the creativity.
So Melanie,
in fact, and in art, I mean, in art also, we can become really systematic. Some great artists fall into a process that they know they can sell. They make the same painting again and again, and they know it's going to sell. So they fall back into easy production. In many ways, they kind of stop or reduce their creativity because they don't experiment anymore. So artists also need to experiment.
okay, so that's interesting that we can't assume that because someone's
they also need to learn. Absolutely, yeah. They also need to learn from science because you can see that science evolve, progress, and so the art world also need to progress and advance. And borrowing a bit of your method is actually useful, but not too much, because otherwise we become scientists ourselves. So it's the whole. But I think it's about the freedom and having the confidence. I think in education, what education gives you is the confidence to let you go for a while. So if you had art mixed with your science, and you know that for 1 or 2 hours you are going to do whatever, it's going to be totally crazy, and eventually you know where it's leading, so you are pleased about the result, you know it's not dangerous, so you do it again, and then by doing it again and again, it becomes part of your, it's like your your space of freedom you have to develop. And it could be painting, it could be music. I mean, I met many mathematicians who are extremely good musicians. They could be violinists, etc. They create music also. There is a lot of link between the two subjects, mathematics and music. The way it's created, it's really, really close. I think for the chemist, I think sculpture might be the good subject for you.
That sounds great. So I'm going to move on now to just, I think both Amanda and Melanie would like to add. I think we'll go with Melanie first, Amanda, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So maybe just to follow up on what Romain said, I appreciate the notion of freedom. I think in my case, the way that I would see creativity is more the engine of progress. You know, you can apply that to art or science, but in that perception, which is mine, of creativity, that means that there is that notion of novelty or originality, maybe above the freedom, but also kind of a context. There is a social, cultural context in which that kind of work needs to fit into. So yeah, the novelty aspect and also the environment goes both, in my opinion, hand in hand when it comes to creativity. That's the only point.
Yeah, I'd kind of like to echo that a bit. I think whilst you can be creative by moving completely outside of your field, I think actually if you're pushing the boundaries of your field, whether it's chemistry or physics, then that is creating new knowledge, and it does involve needing to be able to think in different ways. I think most of us will know that there are also scientists that can get stuck in doing very similar work that's kind of worked before, and that doesn't always end up actually pushing forward the knowledge that one has in science. So I think you can be more within an area and still have that creativity without needing to leave.
Yeah, I know from experience it's very easy to end up working on the really reductionist minutiae in science, and sometimes you forget to take that step back and take a broader view because you get so sucked in. Alan, I know that you want to come in and say something.
Yes, I think on that issue of what, you know, what is creativity, more thinking about how do we interpret it for the scientists. I mean, all of us are are researchers, right? So that in research, there needs to be a level of creativity. I'm not going to say that in any kind of, in all science enterprise, there needs to be a level of creativity, because there are people who are scientists, but they, it is their day job. What they do is, operate machinery and do things like that. So that there's not necessarily a need for a creative process. But I do think in the research context, there has to be a creative process. You can't dissociate the two at all. One thing that we found, obviously, as a network, we find often the way that creativity can somewhat feel stifled in the way that a science is funded. Because there is so much into tackling challenges. Although it is good to tackle the challenges of today, there is so much in what researchers will call fundamental research, or there's fundamental research, there's blue sky research as well, and even just putting those terms next to it, and that those typically are less funded, can often stifle that type of creativity, where you basically can constrain the creativity within a specific challenge. So although there is a need for science to answer the need for those challenges, such as climate change, such as the drive to net zero and other things like that, there is a need for science to be progressive and for not being stifled out of its creativity, to keep on enabling that thinking outside the box, and for that not to be so often left to the extremely successful researchers who just have just enough people and just enough money to be able to do that, because there are so many creative minds out there, people who can think outside the box, revolutionize the way that we see the world. I do wonder whether or not we feel like, where's the next revolution going to come from? We've had the Industrial Revolution, we've had the technology revolution, and maybe some people think there is no more revolutions to be had. Whereas I think that the world constantly needs reinventing, constantly needs looked at and reinvestigated to understand what happens. And only so often are we reminded that this still happens. But the funding that goes behind it, obviously, is sometimes lacking.
Yeah, I know. So that actually brings us on to, I'm conscious of the time, and so I kind of I didn't want to have an entire discussion about catalysing creativity without talking about how we might actually do that going forward. So we've been looking a little bit about the projects that you've done and how that's worked out and the discussions that have arisen from that. But how do you think going forward that art and science worlds can be encouraged to intermingle and collaborate more? And picking up on Alan's point there, about whether there's another revolution coming and what the funding role could be in enabling some new creativity. I just wondered if you wanted to think about how you might bring the two worlds together and whether that's something that would try to do going forwards. Romain.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. When I heard about blue sky research is important, but often the biggest jump in technology and art comes when there is a huge challenge, and when actually we feel restricted and we feel we are under pressure to fund something really quickly and efficiently, and I think right now it's climate change. Just now it's climate change. It's pushing a lot of new technology, and is also focusing the mind of young artists who are trying to think of how to better communicate about this crisis, about the environment, and how we should treat it, and how to communicate about it. So not to be alarmist, not to be scary, to communicate in a positive way. So it's a new big challenge, and I think scientists are already at it, and artists. Each time I talk with an artist, I encourage them to play their part in this, because it's a huge challenge, and because we need to rethink society in a way. That really was the motivation for me to enter this project with you. It was because we need to reshape the way society is organized because of climate change. So it's not blue sky research, it's really to address something that is happening now, and we need to do something.
So Martin, you want to come in?
Yeah, sorry, just unmuting. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point that Romain made there. I think the next revolution could well be knowledge and information. And basically, we got information at our fingertips now through the internet and so on. And what's happening in education is very slow, very cumbersome and anachronistic. And what I think we need to do is to start reshaping education by start thinking about transdisciplinarity. And that means instead of just satisfying the needs of the silos for examinations, we need to start thinking about problems at community level, local level, but also global level. Like Romain said, climate change, pandemics is another one. And I can't think of anything more transdisciplinarity in terms of transdisciplinarity than the pandemic. It's unbelievable the knowledge that draws on. And to give proper solutions, it actually requires integration across all these different knowledge fields. You know, scientists working alongside, communicators alongside, the arts alongside technology, and the way in which it is communicated, and then the literacy side of this. And unless you engage people in a better critical literacy in STEM education, you're going to have a real problem here as more and more problems generate themselves. So I've been involved in quite a few local projects, both here in England and also in South Africa, where we've worked with communities by building in arts into the kind of whole aspect of community development. Water supply in townships near Stellenbosch in South Africa, and a local park project here in Europe. You know, they all use communication, arts, technology in their problem solving.
That's fabulous, Martin, and that's such a wonderful note, and I think we'll actually draw to a close because we're about to run out of time. So I think the real flavour that's come out of today is that everyone actually does feel that the creativity that comes out of bringing together people from different with different skill sets and different idea sets is incredibly valuable, and is actually something that we need as a society going forward if we're going to solve some of the major changes that our societies and our world faces in the coming decades, or maybe sooner. With the pandemic, that's obviously brought forward how quickly we can face a crisis that we did see it sort of coming, but it came upon us very quickly. And obviously climate change is one of those huge areas that we really do need to pay attention to. So thank you, Romain, for promoting that amongst your art colleagues. So I'd like to really thank all our panelists today, Martin, Melanie, Amanda, Romain and Alan, and Bill at the beginning for the introduction, and say thank you so much indeed for taking part in this discussion today, which is, I think, it's been really interesting, and I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to you all. And I love the idea of the engine of progress, and I think I shall just remember that whenever I'm working with things, that actually you do have to keep progressing, whether it's in science or whether it's in art, and hopefully with a melding of the two. So I'd like to thank our audience out there. It's very difficult for us not being able to see you all. We really would prefer to have an in-person event, but you know, the marvels of technology do at least enable us to connect with you all, even if it's through a virtual medium. And finally, I'd really like to thank ScotCHEM and ASCUS for really having the foresight to put together this Catalysing Creativity project and this afternoon's discussion. And so I think with that, we'll draw everything to a conclusion and say thank you very much for joining us, and good afternoon.